SB 1718 is clearly an anti-immigrant law. I will say, in my opinion, one of the most anti-immigrant legislations that this country has ever seen. And it was passed here in the state of Florida in this past legislative session, alongside a bunch of different laws that take away people's rights. SB 1718 focuses on different things that are targeted not only at immigrants, but also at the people who are helping immigrants. And I think that actually doesn't get talked about a lot.
Thanks for tuning in to this episode of I Have Something to Say, where subject matter experts are unafraid and unapologetic about sharing their perspectives regarding issues that impact our lives. They speak up because basically they give a shit. So if you're tired of canned answers and want to finally hear real people cut through the BS and talk about real issues, this is the podcast for you. I'm your host, Sami Marrero from Urbander, and behind our mixer is our producer, Chris Majoka from UdoU.
Hi, everyone, and welcome to this episode of I Have Something to Say. I'm very excited to have as our guest today the Florida State Director for ABIC, and ABIC stands for the American Business Immigration Coalition. And, off my normal job, I've collaborated numerous times at the local, state, and national level with our dear friend Samuel Vilchez. And I just had to invite you over, Samuel, because there's just too much going on not to keep this conversation going and really the advocacy going. And so thank you. Thank you for making time out of your busy schedule to join us.
No, thank you so much for having me. And as you said, there's so much to talk about, especially with everything going on here in Florida and across the country.
Yes, absolutely. And so in the last, I want to say at least year, okay, but more intensely, the past couple of months, we've been really talking a lot about convening leaders in the Latino community, in the Puerto Rican community, and just in the general community to push back against Senate Bill 1718 here in the state of Florida that was just recently passed and put into effect July 1st. And, it's clearly an anti-immigrant law, right? That was just passed. Some people don't want to call it that, but it's evident, right? Because it's designed to really affect, right, migrant communities. And so as a leader in this space and representing the businesses owned by the immigrant community, I thought that it would be awesome to have you so you can kick us off by first explaining to us what this Senate Bill 1718 encompasses, right? And how it started. And then we'll get into the minutia of how mobilizing the community to push back actually work, because it could be worse than it currently is.
So I think you put it in the right way. SB 1718 is clearly an anti-immigrant law. I will say, in my opinion, one of the most anti-immigrant legislations that this country has ever seen. And it was passed here in the state of Florida in this past legislative session, alongside a bunch of different laws that take away people's rights. SB 1718 focuses on different things that are targeted not only at immigrants, but also at the people who are helping immigrants. And I think that actually doesn't get talked about a lot. So some of the things that SB 1718 does is, one, it mandates E-Verify for all employers that have more than 25 employees. And that basically means employers are going to have to utilize the system to verify employment eligibility for all people who apply. That's one. The second one is it creates a new felony for anybody who's bringing someone into the state of Florida who has not been inspected previously by an immigration agent. And that is very concerning because people could face up to 15 years in prison if they bring someone who might be undocumented, but the most important thing is that they have not been inspected by an immigration official. The third thing is it prohibits the funding from local governments for community ID programs that are used not only by immigrants, but also by people who are homeless, people who have been incarcerated in the past, etc. It also will start prohibiting any dreamer or student with DACA or asylum seeker from becoming a lawyer in the state of Florida starting in 2028. And it also requires hospitals to collect immigration status information from all patients when they go. So this is what the actual legislation says, and that's what it was passed by both the House and the Senate in Tallahassee, in the state of Florida. But the reality is that the original proposal was much worse. So there's been a lot of mobilization, primarily from the faith community. The Latino evangelical community was really critical, particularly the Puerto Rican community, the faith community. Then we have the business community, and then obviously people in the community pushed back, and it actually got them to dilute some of the worst pieces of this legislation. So there's a lot of misinformation, primarily because the governor's original proposal looks very different than what the actual law ended up being.
Right. And since the governor's original proposal, right, included these very harsh, right, clauses or mandates, it's stuck in people's minds and in their hearts, and it instilled this fear and panic in the community. And we've seen it, right? Because we work very closely with the migrant community, that it's hard to dispel, right, the how do you say, this fear, and explain to them that these clauses were eliminated, and they were specifically one to do with transporting people of mixed status or undefined status, right, within the state of Florida, which is why the churches, right, push back, because these are their congregations, right, the Latino churches. And the other one had to do with living in the same quarters, right? Could you expand on both?
Yes, so the original proposal by the governor basically said that transporting, concealing, or harboring any undocumented person within the state of Florida would be a third-degree felony with up to 15 years imprisonment. Now, what the law actually says, because of that pushback primarily from the churches, is that transporting people into the state of Florida who have not been inspected by an immigration official could lead to up to a third-degree felony of up to 15 years imprisonment. And the reason I say someone who has not been inspected by an immigration official is because that's how the law defines it. So the reality is most undocumented people in the state of Florida and across the country, they've actually been inspected because they're visa overstayers. They came through an airplane and then they stayed over, right? So they have been inspected, so they don't even qualify. Now, the question is going to be here, how are all of the different sheriff and law enforcement departments going to look at what it means to have been inspected by the federal authorities? And that's exactly why immigration law is a federal issue, because of how complex the immigration system is. The federal government has not want at any point the state and local law enforcement officials to make those determinations.
Yeah. And so it was very worrisome, the original version, because then you would have family members, right,
Right.
pit against family members. And so, I mean, how
I,
awful, cruel, and inhumane is that?
I mean, I'll give you my example. My grandmother, she came at the beginning of the COVID pandemic, right before, 2 months before the COVID pandemic began, from Venezuela. And she didn't want to stay here because she had family in Venezuela. She wanted to go back. But because of the pandemic, she made the determination to stay and not go back, at least until the pandemic happened. Because in Venezuela, the situation around the health crisis was really bad with the pandemic. And she thought that if I go back to Venezuela and I get the pandemic, then I'm going to die. So she stayed. And basically, she was actually thinking about going back, but now there's a new parole program that the federal government implemented. And we were able to bring our family from Venezuela here, my cousin, my aunt, etc. So then she decided to stay, but we haven't processed her paperwork to become a citizen or a resident because she was going to go back, right? So if I would have been caught, or my parents, she lives with my parents could have faced a third-degree felony simply for housing my 80-year-old grandmother. So you can imagine how crazy that was, right? Like churches, she goes to church all the time. She's very involved in her church. Had she gone on a field trip with the church and the pastor at the church could have faced a third-degree felony. So that's why it was actually extremely crazy, and that's why there was a lot of pushback behind the scenes primarily, and they were able to dilute it. Now, it doesn't mean that this is still not one of the worst pieces of anti-immigrant legislation we've seen. It just means that people advocating and speaking up actually made a difference in a state where there's a one-party power, one-party rule, and no one gets to say anything.
Yes, absolutely. And we've seen that, right? We recently had a press conference with leaders of the Latino evangelical faith community, and they were explaining how they intervened and actually pushed back and advocated up in Tallahassee to make this happen. But it's taken a while to really trickle down, right? To the communities and again, as I mentioned before, dispel that fear. And so the unintended consequence, I think, because I think that the governor didn't, think this through,
Of
was
course.
that now we have a crisis, right? From an economic standpoint, because the state of Florida is fueled by, right, hospitality, which includes tourism, construction, right, galore everywhere, even the caring, like healthcare, caring of the elderly, and in the in the healthcare system. We're talking also about agriculture, the food we eat, right, and also business ownership. The Latino immigrant community and the undocumented community contributes billions of dollars. I think it's tens of billions of dollars in taxes, in local taxes, federal taxes, state taxes to the state of Florida. And what's been happening? They're leaving. They're leaving because they're fearful. I think it was mentioned to Georgia and North Carolina and South Carolina, right? Could you talk a little bit
Right.
more about that?
So I'll give you examples from each of these industries, right? Like, because we have over 300 businesses across the state that are members of our coalition, we had someone in construction. They have a big construction business in Jacksonville and across the state. Their managing partner showed up to one of the job sites. Everybody was gone. Like, he had 40% of the employees gone on July 2nd, the day after this law was passed, because everybody was fearing for their life. They're looking to seek opportunity somewhere else. We have someone in the construction industry. They have a family farm that has over 400 employees. One of our members was telling us, I was shooting a commercial utilizing a drone. When I utilized the drone, all the workers started running away because they thought it was the state coming for them. So now you get to see. On the hospitality front, we have a member in Tampa who actually came out of the Tampa Bay Times. Immigration officials came to his business and found out that he had been employing undocumented immigrants. Guess what? He had to shut down because he didn't have employees in order to continue staying in business. And then even on the caring piece, right? Like, Florida is the state where many people choose to retire. We have a very vibrant elderly community. Some of our members in Sarasota who have retired CEOs, retired business leaders, they are now having to wait 6, 7, 8 weeks to get care because the nurses, the janitors, and everyone in their hospitals have left. So we are seeing across the state, in different industry, immigrants basically deciding to leave. And then the other point that people don't talk about is most immigrants in this state are actually part of mixed status families. And what it means is the parents might be undocumented, but the kids are documented. So when the immigrant leaves, they take the whole family, including the people who have papers, who are residents, citizens, etc. So it's not just a matter of like the immigrants picking up and going away. It's their whole community picking up and going away. And in a state where unemployment is 2.7%, we simply don't have the labor force to fill in those jobs, right?
Yeah.
And at the end of the day, we're all gonna pay the cost.
Yes, and the cost is in the form of inflation. I think the latest numbers were that the state of Florida is the one in terms of the inflation, increase. I think it's up to 9%.
9%.
Right. The latest numbers compared to what was it nationwide? I think it's 3 or 4%.
4%. So
Right.
not even double, more than double the inflation
Yeah.
here in Florida, particularly coming from housing, because construction has become so difficult due to the climate change and the heat and people just not having the necessary labor force. And what we're gonna start seeing is our housing prices will continue to go up, our food prices are gonna continue to go up. So when politicians come to you and talk about inflation, you should think about, who is actually causing this inflation and why is it that Florida has almost triple the inflation that the country has.
Yeah, that's insane. And you feel it in everything, right? It's like I I I mean, we just changed our home insurance. I think the major carriers have just lost their minds, right? And so I mean, we're feeling it. We're feeling it in every aspect, and it's because people are going away, and all of those vacancies are not being filled. Okay, and and so one thing is going to happen. Either they're going to have to pay up the gazoo to get people, right, that do have their proper documentation, right, to fill those positions. But business owners don't want to do that, right? People in the agricultural sector can't do that. We went to another advocacy, right, mission to Washington D.C. just this past year to talk about how farmers across the nation are suffering, and the provision of food, we're good that this country is dependent on, on these farmers, and that I think it was this year that we're going to be at zero, right, as a complete dependency on foreign imports to be able to eat. And so what was the the tagline was that food security is national security. This is a real issue, and we're already experiencing it here in Florida, you know?
And the other question we have to ask ourselves is, how does this benefit any of us? Because usually in policy you have trade-offs, right? Like, sure, it has some bad consequences and some positive, and maybe the positives are better than the negatives. But in this case, there's no positive. There's
Mhm.
nothing we can point out to and say the state is better because of this law. And the law
Mhm.
also includes actually $12 million to transport migrants out of the state. And this
Mhm.
program has been running since October of last year. And actually, they're paying $50,000 to transport every migrant from Texas to Massachusetts or Texas to California. And the question is, they're not even here in Florida. So how is that impacting us? And should we really be spending 50,000 a migrant to fly them out from Texas to California? For what reason? What purpose? Other than demonize the migrant themselves to create this political narrative that immigrants are a burden. But that's not the reality. People here in Florida know it. Our communities, like in Orlando, Miami, Jacksonville, Tampa, have been built by immigrant labor. About a third of all entrepreneurs in the state of Florida actually happen to be first generation immigrants.
Right, absolutely. And so the question is, how can, and I know that we convened, right, Puerto Rican Latinos, right? The Puerto Rican community here in Central Florida, particularly, but really across the state, to come together and support initiatives and this movement to go against and advocate for a change in this law, to really just eliminate it altogether. Because even though as Puerto Ricans we do have US citizen through birth, right? And that's a whole other conversation how we got there, right? At the end of the day, we know what displacement feels like, right? We know what trying to navigate a new culture is like, especially for the Puerto Rican diaspora that comes from the island in the aftermath of, for example, Hurricane Maria, but even before that, because of the economic turmoil, right? And the corruption that was happening in the island and still is. And so now being here on the US mainland, we are coming to this reckoning, right? This realization that espérate, un momentito, let's pause for a minute here, right? If
Mhm.
there's 1.2 million Puerto Ricans in the state of Florida, right? And right now when you look at the state numbers, I think one of every four people in the state of Florida is of Latino descent. You know, this makeup of the new demographic of the state of Florida is really leaning heavily Latino and heavily actually Puerto Rican. I mean, people used to look at South Florida and the vibrant, Cuban community, but now we're seeing a more diverse, right? A community that is really convening and coming together to really combat all of these legislations that are really designed to, I feel like almost like to avoid the acceleration of our presence, of our power, of our participation, and of our voices. And so I really want to take a moment to commend the efforts that ABIC has done, that you have done, not only through ABIC, but you've been a community leader, since I've met you, and we're talking a decade ago. But then also other leaders like Soraya Marquez with Mi Familia Vota, right? Who is not Puerto Rican. She's not Puerto Rican, but had the foresight of unifying and bringing together all of our communities to really stand strong together and work to help mitigate, right, the impact of this law, and also strategize to
Right.
figure out what can we do, right, to mobilize and participate in greater scale in the electoral process to really make our power felt, right? And so what are your impressions of what's been happening, especially in the last, I want to say, 12 weeks or so?
Yeah. So the first thing is here in the United States, all of our identities are socially constructed, right? So to the white majority, it doesn't really matter if you're Puerto Rican, Venezuelan, Mexican, Cuban, Nicaraguan. They simply haven't been exposed for them to know. And we've seen cases with Puerto Ricans who have been denied entry into an airplane or even being able to rent a car because they don't think their IDs and driver's licenses from Puerto Rico actually count here in the United States. And what's happening there is that we're being defined as Latino and as the monolithic of what Latino is, even though we know in the Latino community that we're all different. So that's the first point. The second point is, you know, anti-immigrant legislation has been passed in other states before. We had in California Proposition 178. We had in Arizona, we have SB 1070. And those moments in those two states served as a catalyst for people to come together and fight hard against, you know, the establishment at that moment. So we saw California went from being a red state to a blue state and now a super blue state. We saw in Arizona that SB 1070 law was passed in 2010. Last year, we led a campaign to allow in-state tuition for dreamers, and it passed with a majority of the vote. So what we're saying here is, SB 1718 is a moment for us to come together. And it could be a catalyst for change and an incredible opportunity for us to say, enough. An attack against one of us is an attack against all of us. And I think I've been really pleasantly surprised by the Puerto Rican community and the Puerto Rican leadership here in Central Florida, in Tampa, in Miami, coming together to say we stand strongly with the immigrant community. Because while the Puerto Ricans might not face, similar issues, the reality is if we're gonna achieve change, we're going to need that Puerto Rican population and the Puerto Rican community in Florida to come together with the rest of the Latino community. But don't forget, we have immigrants from Haiti, we have immigrants from Jamaica, the Bahamas, all across Asia, the Philippines, Vietnam, etc., coming all together as one to say, this is not okay, and this goes against all of us. And again, I'm very excited to see the Puerto Rican community take leadership on this issue because it is needed. And then obviously, the rest of the immigrant community has to reciprocate as well with the issues being faced by the Puerto Rican community.
Absolutely. And the thing is, so we're talking now about the state of Florida, clearly because it's home right now, right? It's like what you call it, the last the last migration, right? For many of us. This is home, but it's something that it's important to discuss because it's happening here now, but it could very easily, right, happen in other states. And that's a very scary thing, and we see this with other, legislation that's been passed that strips the rights away from people, and case in point, abortion rights, right? And so it's important to have these discussions and present what's happening here, perhaps at the local or the state level, because you can blink your eyes and all of
Yeah.
a sudden it becomes a national problem. And then what, right? Because this country again has been built on the backs, right, of people from the diaspora, or wherever, they originally are from, or call home, right, or identify as their birthplace or their ancestry. And so, what are your thoughts about the
There,
possibilities, right, of this spreading to other states?
there's a popular proverb that says, "They came for the socialists and I did nothing. They came for the women and I did nothing. They came for the Jews and I did nothing. And then they came for me. So there was no one to do nothing for me." Right? And I think that's exactly what we're seeing here in the state of Florida and across the country. The reality is, we know that the playbook is very clear, and that is to use Florida as a laboratory for these extremist ideas, and then pass them here and basically say, if it worked in Florida, if we were able to do it in Florida, we can do it across the country. We've seen it with different laws. We saw it with the full abortion ban after week 6. We've seen it with the Don't Say Gay legislation in the state. We've seen it with anti-trans legislation in the state. Now, anti-immigrant legislation. There are other legislation that is very concerning. And now we're starting to see copycat bills being presented in other states. And that's why also, if you're not from Florida, don't think that this doesn't affect you. So really need to be paying attention to what's happening here, as this is the battleground for our democracy. That's what Florida has become. I think there's one side that thinks they can just utilize the rule to take power and rights away from everyone, and then use that model and replicate it across the country. And that is very dangerous. And that's why Florida is so important right now. And especially all of our communities where there's so much misinformation, and they might not really know what's going on and how everything that's happening might impact them.
And so it was very compelling to me and very eye-opening to me to learn of some of the things that we can do, for example, Puerto Ricans specifically, to really combat or documented Latinos, right? That to combat um, the mandates. And for example, if you go to a clinic, health hospital, and they ask for your immigration status or your ethnicity, just don't fill it out. Just don't fill it out at all, right? Don't give in to this. And so then, it's better to just let them wonder at this point. But if we all convene and we all agree to not answer these questions because they're not mandatory, right? Then it'll afford everybody in our Latino community to find the health access to the healthcare that they need when they're feeling ill or in the case of an emergency. Another thing that I learned too is that the Puerto Rican business community also can invest in creating resources to help, right, disseminate information that will dissipate the fear, because that's the thing, because there's so much misinformation, we have to combat it, right? And so by investing in creating messaging and providing access and printing materials, we're talking about putting creating a series of bumper stickers, right, to put on the windows of different establishments, like retail stores, or even restaurants, for example, that are owned by immigrant business owners, and also by Puerto Ricans, to say, hermano inmigrante, estamos contigo, like we're here with you. This is a safe space, and that where we can also disseminate or distribute information, like for example, what to do when faced with an authority, right? Like you don't have to talk. You don't have to respond to questions. You can say, I'm going to remain quiet and I want to speak to a lawyer, right? I'm not going to sign anything too, like don't fill out any paperwork, and just informing the community about what their rights are too within the system, so that way they can protect themselves. Anything else that comes to mind that would be helpful?
Well, first of all, I think the videos that you started with Urbander educating the immigrant community have been incredible, and I'm sure that as we continue doing them, they will become really helpful, especially if we push them out to WhatsApp, or our people are in and paying attention. The other thing I would say, if you're a business owner, or just in general, and you have the ability to provide a lawyer to an undocumented person, perhaps someone in temporary status who you work with, then please do so. The reality is most people who go to a lawyer can actually find some form of relief, so that's great. The second thing that I think will be important is doing outreach and advocacy at the local level. A lot of this legislation will be implemented by our local law enforcement officials, so we need to be, watching out for what those law enforcement officials are doing in our cities, in our counties, etc. So that's important, especially I would say in Central Florida, where the Puerto Rican community has so much power. And then just dissipating information across the community at churches, at supermarkets, in businesses, in the school system, so important in this, the hospitals, really going to where people are at and educating them, opening an arm, and really making them feel welcome here in the state of Florida, and just fighting back in whatever way possible. That's what you can do now. Next year in 2024, you actually have an ability to vote people out, right?
Mm.
So when you're getting ready to vote, look up people's voting records. Look up your legislators' voting record. How did they vote? Did they vote for or against immigrants? And then use that to guide your vote. That is so important. Register to vote. Now everyone in Florida have to register to vote by mail again, because they just changed that rule. So make sure your abuelito, your abuelita is registered to vote by mail, because they might be expecting that to come and it will never come, right? And then just get out there and be loud, and be outspoken, and let people know you stand very clearly with the immigrant community.
Yes, and it is so important. One of the scary things though is that we just recently had the situation with Judge Worrell, right? That she was voted in by a landslide too. And then now the governor, all of a sudden, I mean, I can't even wrap my head around that, right? So that's very scary too, because it's very caprichoso, at a whim, right? And completely against what this democracy is all about. You vote people in, and they're supposed to complete their term until the next election. And if they don't do a good job, the people will then vote them out. But that's not the case here. And so, what are your thoughts about that?
So it's not the first time that happens. It happened to State Attorney Monique Borrell, but it had happened to Andrew Warren out of Hillsborough County last year. It's happened to a
Mm.
number. It's happened to a numbers of school board members across the state who were not willing to open schools when it was not safe to open those schools. And it will continue to happen unless we say enough, right? The state cannot be determining who we're electing for these positions. It is undemocratic and it is unbecoming of whoever wants to exercise this power. Because at the end of the day, there is an election and we get to determine who we vote for and who we want to be represented by. And what happened in the case of State Attorney Monique Worrell is it's really disgusting also, because a lot of the programs that she was utilizing that actually led to a decrease in crime in Orange and Osceola counties were utilized to blame her for things that are not really happening. It was completely political. And her chief of staff, who had just had a baby and was on medical leave, received the police in her house asking her to provide keys and passwords to social media, et cetera, et cetera. And what's happening here is very dangerous. It is, we hadn't seen that in the United States in a long time. I'm not going to say that it's unprecedented because this country has a dark history that most should know of, but it hasn't happened in a long time. And it seems that we're going backwards. And the only way to stop us from going backwards is for us to say, enough, we got to move forward and really do our jobs as citizens and as people who are able to vote in this country and doing our research. And while it is hard, there is people in this community who are willing to do that, to
Yes,
help you out
absolutely.
and figure it out.
Yes, yes, and I agree, and I just feel that, in the end, love will prevail, humanity will prevail, because we're this again. This is not really a political issue from the people advocating. It's about it's about protecting human dignity, keeping families together, ensuring children are not growing up with trauma, safeguarding our economy. Okay, if for anything else, right? Safeguarding the economy, and that you're able to live, right, with appropriate wages and a dignified life, right, here in the state of Florida, which is becoming so freaking expensive. It's really uncanny. And at the end of the day, I just feel that it's just important to continue talking, knocking on doors, trying to put information out there that really debunks this idea that advocating for humanity is somehow a political
And
agenda.
the other thing is it's not partisan, right?
Hmm.
The fight for immigrant rights has gone against both parties when needed. 10 years ago, when it was President Obama who was deporting immigrants, young immigrants and young dreamers, you know, put themselves in the front line and went to protest all of his campaign offices until they eventually got him to act and realize what he was doing is wrong. That's exactly what we're doing here. It doesn't really matter what party you're from. If you're attacking our communities, you have to be held accountable. It just happens to be that in the state of Florida, we have a one party rule. But the reality is that this is not a partisan issue.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think that and what's the root cause, right? Of all of this? It's really control and power. At the end of the day, of a dominant class, over uh what's right now, or has been until very soon, a minority. But that shift is happening. That shift that's going to happen nationwide, where it's a new global majority, is going to happen, here in the state of Florida within the next 3, 4, 5 years, even, right? Whereas nationwide, it's going to happen in 2045. And why? Because the last data that I saw from USA Facts states that 52.7% of the population in Florida is white. Okay, and so white only, right? While so that's it. We're right there at the cusp. So this is going to happen very soon, and I think that's why also we're feeling it so hard here, because it's so imminent, right? But I don't understand,
And
what the fear is.
That's exactly what happened in California, right when they were at the cost. They passed Prop 178 that tried to take away, the right of schooling for immigrant children. And that's when people got together and say, I'm not taking this anymore. And that's exactly what we got to do here. And the other sad part about Florida is also it seems that these politicians are putting their own personal ambitions to seek power ahead of our collective ambition to be able to live prosperous lives. And that's what's happening here. The state economy is going to suffer very strongly from this legislation. And we've already seen so many different companies canceling their conferences here in Orlando,
Yeah.
in South Florida. And that will only continue unless we all come together and say, that's not the Florida we want to see. We want a welcoming Florida where everybody feels that they can live a prosperous and dignified life.
Absolutely. And so, just to make sure that you recognize, these words for everyone listening and, just learn it. Enough is enough. In Spanish is basta ya, because you'll
Basta.
probably hear that. You're going to hear that often now, again with this shift. So that way, when you hear basta ya, you know that it means enough is enough, right? Any closing comments, Samuel? Any like call to action? I know that you've already shared a lot, but what would you say are like the key takeaways that you want to leave in closing?
I think the main thing is we determine our own actions. We don't have much control about what other people do, but we have the ability to decide what we want to do and what we actually do. So if you live in a community where your neighbor might be an immigrant and you don't know their status, just go to them and say, hey neighbor, I'm with you, I'm with the immigrant community. If you are, at the schools and you go to the school and you see that your children's friends are immigrants, make sure you create a welcoming space for them. When you go vote, make sure you're looking at people's records, not just at their party, not just at their gender, not just whether they're Latino or not Latino. Really look, what have they done for us? What have they done for immigrants? And use that to determine whether you want to vote for them or not. Also, just in general, be able to prioritize our community whenever you are looking to go through your day, to go through your routine. And even though it might be difficult, that's really how we can push back against a lot of these legislation. And if we don't push back now, they're gonna try to take everyone's rights away. So your own personal rights, your family, your values might really be on the line here. So don't think that it's not with you. It's with all of us. And the other thing is, si se puede. We can do this because we're standing on the shoulders of generations that have constantly pushed our democracy forward. And we have the ability to do so again, but only if we come together and we really unite behind, our immigrant and Latino community, but just in general, the idea that we can be a welcoming place and a welcoming state for all.
Thank you so much, Samuel. It's just so inspiring to have this conversation. It gives me hope, to know that we're working side by side together and that we can have this candid, open conversation to share with everybody that's watching and listening. Because, just maybe, right? We can showcase what could possibly happen and change the hearts of people that may be up against the fence or just don't or not well informed about the repercussions, right, of legislation like this. And so thank you for making this time, and I'll see you in the trenches.
And remember, the sun rises after the darkest hour of the night. And that's exactly what we need to push for here, a sunrise, so we can feel that we can live in this state and that we can welcome people, including obviously our immigrant communities. Thank you so much. I really love this. And I'll see you in the trenches.
Thank Thanks for tuning in to this episode of I Have Something to Say, where subject matter experts are unafraid and unapologetic about sharing their perspectives regarding issues that impact our lives. They speak up because basically they give a shit. So if you're tired of canned answers and want to finally hear real people cut through the BS and talk about real issues, this is the podcast for you. I'm your host, Sami Marrero from Urbander, and behind our mixer is our producer, Chris Majoka from UdoU.